All right, hello everyone. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about one of our special senses, focusing specifically on our eyes and focusing on the special sense of vision. So if you recall from the previous lecture, uh, we discussed the idea of general senses or general sensation. So when we talked about general sensation, we were talking about senses and general sensory receptors that were distributed throughout the body, right? So these were things like touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception, pain, detecting temperature, things like this, right? So very distributed throughout the body, right? It's very diffuse. Whereas now we're going to look at, in this lecture and in the previous lecture, or in the subsequent lectures, we're going to look at special senses. So these are going to be senses that are associated with specific sensory receptors that are dedicated to a specific region of the body and have a dedicated organ to them. So obviously our special sense of vision has the dedicated organ of the eye, smell has the nose, taste the tongue, audition or hearing the ear, so on and so forth, right? So what we're going to look at first, and kind of the first part of this lecture, is some anatomy of the eye. So we're going to look at the gross anatomical features, some accessory structures, some actual parts of the eye itself, and then we will move into talking about some actual physiology of vision. So how do we actually see? What are the pigments we need? What are the specific cell types, and how does all of this work together to actually produce vision? So where we'll start is we'll start by talking about, as we said, some of the gross anatomical features of the eye. So before we do that, there are some general principles that relate to sensory receptors in general. And so we have different types of receptors that we discussed in chapter 12 with general sensation. So these are things like chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, photoreceptors, baroreceptors, thermoreceptors, nociceptors, right? All these different kinds. We have receptor potentials that are generated when a stimulus or a sensory modality stimulates a particular sensory receptor. We have sensory coding where this signal or this stimulus is transduced into an action potential. It travels to the central nervous system, and then our brain perceives that as some type of stimulus or some type of sensation, so touch, pressure, whatever it may be. And then we can have sensory adaptation, right? So our sensory receptors are able to respond to different stimuli or a constant stimulus in different ways depending on the specific type of receptor. So what we're going to focus on specifically here is we're going to focus on these sensory receptors. So right up here, we're going to focus on sensory receptors known as photoreceptors, all right? So photoreceptors, the photo refers to a photon of light or a single unit of light. These receptors are going to be responsible for detecting and being stimulated by this one unit of light, this one photon, as we will see. Okay, so whenever we look at some things related to our eyes, we know that our eyes and what we're picking up from our eyes is light, right? And so we have various wavelengths of light, and where our visible light comes from meaning on the visible spectrum, is that generally between 400 and 700 nanometers. Okay, and so between these ranges, these different wavelengths result in different colors, right? And so we know these can be things like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? So you've heard of the term Roy G. Biv. And so everywhere in between these ranges within this 400 nanometer to 700 nanometer wavelength, this is what's termed our visible spectrum. So this is the specific wavelength of light that we are able to detect. Okay. Now, our cells in our body, we have rods and we have cones, these photoreceptors in our eye. We have rods and cones. So our rods are going to be responsible for kind of dim light, low light vision, so very poor acuity, poor color vision, whereas our cones are going to be responsible for more sharp vision, more precise, and specifically color vision. And we'll see that we have three different types of cones, and these are sensitive to three general wavelengths. So we have cones that are sensitive specifically to red, we have ones that are sensitive specifically to blue, and we have ones that are sensitive specifically to green. And so stimulation of these different photoreceptors, these different cones, ones that are sensitive to red, blue, and green, in different quantities, in different ways, results in us being able to see all of these different colors within this visible spectrum. Okay, so a combination of cones that are stimulated results in us being able to see shades of red, blue, green, and all of these different colors in between. Okay, so when we look at our eye from a gross anatomical standpoint, it has kind of main parts or main structures, and then it has what are called accessory structures. Okay, so accessory structures are kind of all of those things outside of the actual eyeball itself. So the eyelids and eyelashes and muscles and all these other things. Okay, so these accessory structures are not playing a direct role in vision, meaning they're not actually responsible for us being able to perceive the light that we are sensing as some type of vision. Okay, so we have things like eyebrows, we have things like eyelashes, eyelids. These are all accessory structures surrounding the eye. So we obviously have an upper and lower eyelid. We have upper and lower eyelashes as well, and then we have upper eyebrows, right? And so these all serve to protect the eye. They serve to kind of provide this kind of guard on the superior and the inferior aspect. Things like eyelids, and we'll see here in a little bit, can produce different oils, mucus and saline and whatnot that can kind of cover over the anterior aspect of our eye, the superficial aspect, and provide it with some protection. Okay, so things like our eyebrows and eyelashes are also helping to keep foreign material, whether it's dust, some type of particle, it may be like an insect or something small, keeping that out of our actual eye so it doesn't impede our vision. Okay, so we have something also known as the conjunctiva, and so the conjunctiva is another accessory structure. It's not directly involved in actual phototransduction or involved in us actually being able to see, but it is this thin membrane that lines the lines the kind of anterior and very superficial layer of our eye. So if we look here, if we were to trace the location of the conjunctiva lines kind of all this region here, and it kind of comes and folds down, and then you'd also find it down here. So it will come down here, and it will line all this region here that we see in red. Okay, so there are different parts to the conjunctiva. There's one called an ocular conjunctiva. So it kind of runs on the anterior surface of the sclera, so it would kind of come out here like this. You have a palpebral conjunctiva, which is down here in this fold of our eyelid, and this is a thin membranous lining over the surface that serves to protect it. And if you have ever had, or if you ever heard of pink eye, which is known as conjunctivitis, and we'll look at that in just a second, that is an inflammation or potentially an infection that causes an inflammation of this conjunctiva, right? So whenever we look here, we know that conjunctivitis is the inflammation of that sclera and of that superficial conjunctiva that overlies the eye, overlies the sclera, overlies the cornea, okay? So whenever this is inflamed, whenever it is irritated, it becomes pink and it becomes irritated, right? So this is why we refer to this as pink eye. So if you've ever had this, you could have some itching, maybe some burning, kind of scratching and pain associated with the eye. The best way to prevent this from happening is to prevent things from getting into your eye that would cause conjunctivitis, right? So this would be things like bacteria. So one of the major things that you'll learn in future courses, and if you go into something like nursing school or some type of health professional school, is something known as hand hygiene, right? And so hand hygiene is simply the idea of washing your hands frequently and washing them well to lower the bacterial load on your hands. So whenever you touch your mouth, you touch your eyes, or you touch whatever, you are not introducing as many pathogens and as many bacteria, right? So wash your hands often, and if you do happen to have it, antibiotic drops may be necessary if it's due to a bacteria, and if it is viral, obviously antibacterial drops are not going to do anything if it's viral, so generally you just kind of wait that one out, okay? So you also have something known as the lacrimal apparatus associated as a kind of accessory structure, accessory system of our eye, and this is what is responsible for producing our tears, okay? So our lacrimal apparatus and our lacrimal gland specifically sits in the superior and lateral aspect of your orbit. So if you think of like your right eye, think of the middle of your right eye. If you go up, so you go superior and lateral, in that general area, that's where you're going to have your lacrimal gland. So here's the middle of the eye right here, and then this structure right here. This is our lacrimal gland. Okay, so the lacrimal gland receives autonomic innervation, and whenever it is innervated, it will produce tears, right? And so this tear, this lacrimal fluid, will flow from the gland out of these ducts, and it will come over and it will bathe the anterior surface of the eye. As it covers the eye, it comes over here to this little region here where it is drained from the eye. So it comes from the gland, comes across the eye, bathes it, and goes into this region here known as the lacrimal puncta. Okay. Now, this lacrimal puncta, this is where the fluid is drained, and there are small little ducts, little openings that drain from this lacrimal puncta into something known as the lacrimal sac. So these little extensions that you see here, these are known as the lacrimal canaliculi. Okay, lacrimal canaliculi. If you think back to skeletal system, you talked about canaliculi, just these little passageways. So these little passageways here are called lacrimal canaliculi. They drain into this structure here called the lacrimal sac. From the lacrimal sac, tears will flow inferiorly through the structure known as the nasolacrimal duct, and then tears end up in the nasal cavity, right? They end up down here. So this is why anytime you cry, you oftentimes get a kind of stuffy, sniffly, runny nose, right? So the tears coming from your lacrimal gland, coming across your eye, drain down and end up in your nose, and that is what's causing that congestion and that kind of runny, stuffy nose that's associated with crying, right? So one other main feature, one component of our tears is lysozyme. And so lysozyme is an antibacterial, antimicrobial compound. So it helps to reduce and prevent the proliferation and development of bacteria in our eye. Okay, so it serves a protective feature in this sense. Okay, all right. So the way that tears flow across the eye is they start in the lacrimal gland. Okay, so we're starting here with number 1, and these numbers kind of correspond to this region over here. So we start with number 1. They're starting in our lacrimal gland. So we're starting right here, right? From number 1, they're going to go and bathe across the anterior surface of the eye to that lacrimal puncta. Okay, so those little holes there in the medial aspect of your orbit. And you can generally see these well if you go look in the mirror. You can see this lacrimal puncta. All right. From this lacrimal puncta, they're going to have those lacrimal canaliculi here. So this lacrimal canaliculus is what this one's called, so just a singular one, into this lacrimal sac here. From the lacrimal sac down the nasolacrimal duct, and then into the nose, right? And so it can go into the nose. There is actually a posterior attachment, or a posterior opening running from the nose into the oral cavity, into the nasopharynx and down to the oral cavity. So you can also potentially end up swallowing that as well, because tears that were in the nasal cavity, if it goes posterior, they can kind of come back in this region here into the nasopharynx and it can enter essentially into the oral cavity. Okay, so this fluid, we've been saying tears. The tears are technically the excess fluid that cannot be drained by this lacrimal puncta and this lacrimal apparatus here. So as fluid bathes across this eyeball, if there is so much that it can't all drain into this lacrimal puncta, into the lacrimal sac and duct, it will be shed onto the face, and we know this as tears, right? So the tears is the excess fluid that cannot be drained. All right. Whenever we look, when we continue looking at accessory structures and some external superficial aspects around our eye, we also have muscles that move our eye, right? So whenever you're moving your eyes across this screen, whenever you're looking at your phone, whenever you're reading, whenever you're driving, anything, and you are scanning your environment, and you are looking in front of you, you're moving your eyes, it is due to one of these 6, or usually more than one or more of these 6 muscles here. So we have 4 what are called rectus muscles, and the term rectus in this case, so we have a superior, an inferior, a lateral, and a medial. Rectus means straight, okay? So these muscles are going to run straight. All right, now I know my arrow is not perfectly straight, but the idea here is that it's going to be straight. The term oblique for these superior and inferior oblique means that the muscle is curved, okay? So we have a superior oblique right here, and we have an inferior oblique right down here, all right? So this means that these muscles are curved, and the orientation of the muscle fibers, whether it's the rectus muscle or it is the oblique muscle, will determine which direction the eye moves, right? So simply, the rectus muscles, if you contract the superior rectus, you look up. If you contract the inferior rectus, you look down. If you contract the medial rectus, you look medially. And if you contract the lateral rectus, you look laterally. Okay, so those are relatively straightforward. Now, the oblique muscles are a little bit more difficult, and it's really helpful if you have an actual model and you're actually able to look at the superior view and the inferior view of these muscles. But their location, or the name of the muscle, and the action that it produces is almost kind of counterintuitive. So the superior oblique, we're looking at this one right here. The superior oblique technically causes your eye to look down, right? So what it does is, as it pulls on the eye, it pulls kind of from a posterior aspect and causes the eye to rotate downward. Whenever you look at the inferior oblique here, this one right here, it actually causes your eye to look superior. So this one right here, whenever it contracts, it actually causes your eye to kind of look upward a little bit. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you have a model, it makes a little bit more sense. Okay, but the idea here is that these muscles are rotating the eye. They're moving it left, right. They're moving it up, down, and they're also moving it kind of up and to the right, up and to the left, down and to the right, and down and to the left. Okay. Now, our cranial nerves, we have various cranial nerves that will be responsible for moving these, and these are largely our cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6. Okay, so our oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nerves. These are the ones that are going to be innervating these 6 extraocular eye muscles. Okay, these are called extraocular, sometimes called extrinsic muscles of the eye. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with the tunics, also known as layers of the eye, in the next part.